How did this not lead to confusion in your real life? Like you're outside of the computer world where you're like, I created Wails, and they're like, you didn't create the country, bud. Like they didn't get confused?
There's a lot of confusion in my life, John.
They probably don't think he means he's created the country Wales. That probably isn't the...
I mean, if he's out at the bar or something and he's like, I made this Wails, they're like, this guy's just had too many. Let him be.
Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean, Droplets, Managed Kubernetes, Managed Databases, Spaces, Object Storage, Volume Block Storage, Advanced Networking like Virtual Private Clouds and Cloud Firewalls, Developer Tooling like the robust API and CLI to make sure you can interact with your infrastructure the way you want to. DigitalOcean is designed for developers and built for businesses. Join over 150,000 businesses that develop, manage, and scale their applications with DigitalOcean. Head to do.co/changelog to get started with a $100 credit. Again, do.co/changelog.
Let's do it. It's go time.
Welcome to Go Time, your source for diverse discussions from around the Go community. Next week on the pod, security is back in focus as Matt welcomes Katie Hockman, Roberto Clappis, and Filippo Valsorda to the show for a deep dive on fuzzing and a close look at the official fuzzing proposal for Go. Subscribe now if you haven't already at changelog.com/GoTime or your favorite podcast app. Okay, here we go.
Hello and welcome to Go Time. I'm Matt Riot. About 6 months ago, or I suppose 3 months if you listen to this on 2 times speed, we chatted with Ilias about Geo, which is a way to draw graphical interfaces and build desktop apps in Go. And there's also the Fine project, which gives you tools to build native UIs, but they kind of have a different thing to learn in order to get to use them. So we're going to look today at an alternative approach, which probably will use a lot of existing skills that are already around, which is where we can mix the desktop and web technologies using the Wails project. That's what we're going to talk about today. Joining me on this quest, John Calhoun. Hello, John.
Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm good, mate. Have you getting all your jobs done that you were telling me about?
I think I have most things done that I need to for today.
Oh, you're so good. Yeah. Makes me feel bad because I've achieved very little today. And joining us also, only the creator of Wails, Lea Anthony. Hello, Lee.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening.
Welcome to Go Time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. So maybe we could just get started at the beginning. When we talk about desktop apps in Go, what do we mean and why is it such an interesting subject compared to other types of things that you can build in Go?
I think originally, when I first sort of started with Go, I mean, I went along the same path as everybody else, making CLI apps, making servers. I'd come from a Node world at the time. And so I was kind of doing similar things on the back end. And kind of one of the things that I thought about when I was learning Go was, how can I make visual things? I love visual things. So the obvious thing to do there is to create a server and to hook up your browser to it and to see things visually that way. I sort of went along that approach, thought, what shall I do? Shall I make what sort of application shall I make as a test? And I was using Restic at the time to do my backups. And I thought, that's quite a good idea. Like, it's fairly static. There's, some information that you can get from the application. It didn't really have a good library. I still don't think it does, actually. So there's a bit of, shelling out and running code and trying to parse the output and all that stuff. But what I discovered pretty quickly was that what you could actually do through a web browser was, by its very nature, sort of fairly restricted. And I kind of wanted to still use all of that funky JavaScript stuff on the front end, all of the, the nice libraries and and tools that you could use to do visual stuff, but to hook it up to my Go application. And so, so like I said, I kind of hit that sort of sandbox restriction pretty quickly. And I thought, how can I marry the two things that I now really love, which is this amazing, traditionally back-end language with a very rich ecosystem in front-end technologies. And that's where it kind of started. And I didn't really get my first break on that until I found the WebView project. And so that allows you to present web front-end using a single JavaScript, single HTML, single CSS. And I started looking at that and I thought, that's cool. Like, that would be really great if I could combine this with Go. And they do allow you to do that. But there was a lot of sort of technical stuff you had to deal with, message passing and all that stuff. And so that's really kind of like the birth of the project there. How do I make this easy for other people and myself, obviously?
Yeah, that's cool then. So the idea is you want to be able to use web technologies, JavaScript, HTML, and even web frameworks. And I noticed that by default, I think Wails comes with React, right? Or is it Vue?
It comes with both. So one of the key things to start with, and I know she said Rails then, right? And it is a play on words on that. I'd actually called it that for basically because I wanted this sort of quick scaffolding way of building up an application, and Rails was the original to do that. And so it was kind of a play on words, WebView, Rails. And so it takes a kind of similar approach. It comes with a CLI. So you use that to scaffold out your project. It comes with a bunch of templates. So you can use Vue, React, Angular. There's a couple of Vue templates there that use Beautify to give you the material UI. And there's also like a vanilla JavaScript one you can use as well.
Yeah, that's cool then. So, because the point is you're going to serve those static assets essentially. Whatever the front-end technology is going to do to build, essentially it's going to build a JavaScript, a CSS, maybe in some markup. And then Wails will serve that, won't it, into its own kind of front end, which is web-based.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. So there's essentially two parts to your project. There's your Go part, which is your backend, and then there's the web front end. And they're sort of fairly loosely coupled. The concerns of the front end is entirely yours. You can use whatever you want. At the end of the day, you basically compile down to your classic sort of dist directory, and you have your bundles, and you essentially end up with 2 or 3 assets. And the way that's sort of bound together is through basically a library that that Wails provides. You create your application, and then you, as part of the creation of that object, of that struct, then you give it a link to your assets, essentially, and it will serve them in front. So the way that it does that is it actually uses a packer. Originally, I used Mark Waite's packer, and then he deprecated it, and I was very upset. So I took on the challenge and wrote something fairly similar, because I really like the way it worked. And they're essentially just strings. Like, you just pass strings to the object, and it takes those and serves those.
And so that the reason you do that then is so that when you ship the app, you don't have to ship alongside it those assets. They get bundled inside, because of a build step, inside the binary, don't they?
That's absolutely right, yeah.
So you still only have to ship one thing.
That's correct. There's no extra thing that you have to supply with it.
Mm-hmm.
It also uses, the WebView framework uses the web renderer that sits on your system. So you don't need to supply that. And there's pros and cons with that. So.
Yeah. Well, we can get into that. So what sort of apps can you build with Wails then?
So, that's like saying, what kind of websites can you build? You can build.
What kind of websites can you build?
I guess one of the key targets for this application would be somebody who wants the sort of power of Go. So, somebody who wants to perhaps do low-level stuff, USB stuff. Got a couple of projects that deal with, I noticed that are working in the cryptocurrency space. So there's a lot of sort of processing that happens. And it's for people who want to just present that sort of stuff visually, where you perhaps, otherwise you maybe use a web browser to connect to, but that's kind of feel quite right. And it's something that you want to interact with in real time. but still have that power of Go. So that's really your target. There's a keyboard company in Japan called Ergo.exe. They create these amazing keyboards, the ones that have like a million different parts and are super ergonomic. One of their main developers contacted me a while back, and he was using WebView to do their firmware flasher. And so he's recently ported their application called Wally, which is their firmware flasher for their keyboards. He's ported it over to Wails. I've worked pretty closely with him. I didn't really have to do much. He gave us some great feedback, and I was really sort of happy about that because it really shows the kind of depth of application you could do.
Yeah, it's interesting because we do think of Go a lot running as a server with HTTP interfaces and things. And so when you start to then think, well, now this is going to be running in its entirety on a single machine, for a person that's running it in the desktop context. And it's kind of a different way of thinking in some ways, aren't there? But does it end up being quite similar because you have this front end that's communicating somehow with the back end through some kind of procedure calls, isn't it? Like remote procedure calls. That becomes the way that the back end and the front end communicate. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The difference is that mechanism there, and this was a key part of the design of the project, that mechanism for communication is completely hidden from you. So instead of having to worry about messages, requests, parameters, all that sort of stuff, you actually just call functions. So there is the IPC mechanism. The way that it works is that you essentially bind Go functions or struct methods to your application, and they get presented at the front end through a JavaScript endpoint. So it will be Windows.backend. And then it'll be a package name because you have to qualify your methods and your structs, and then just the name of the Go method that you bound. That receives, parameters that would be sent through to your backend code. Your backend code will run, and the result of that will be sent back to JavaScript. And that mapping was pretty interesting. And the way that it was done was through promises. So what it sort of figured out early on was that if you had a Go method that returned a value and an error, that's essentially the same as a promise. And so what happens is if you send a value back and the error is null, then the promise results. If you send an error back, then the promise rejects. And so you're able to easily deal with the backend calling the backend code as if it's sort of part of your application, which it is obviously, but part of your front end application.
Yeah. So does it preserve types as well then? If you're passing strings and integers, can you call them in your JavaScript code using those types and they turn up as those types in the Go side?
Going from yes is the answer, pretty much. It mostly does type conversions. I use one of the sort of low-level Go functions to do that type conversion. So on the whole, yes. Structs appear as JSON in JavaScript. If you send structs down to Go, they appear as sort of a standard map string interface. It can be tricky, but it deals with the 90% case, I think 95% case. So that's kind of handy.
Yeah, that's so cool. How does it do that then? How does, from the user's point of view, you're just calling JavaScript asynchronous functions and there's promise returned and then they either resolve or they get rejected. So that makes sense from that point of view. But how does it actually communicate between the web component, the web view component, and the Go code? What's the mechanism that's being used to make that work?
So web views provide the ability to call native functions. So you can set up an endpoint. In WebView, it's window.external-invoke. And whatever you pass to that ends up on the listening end. So that method actually, what I had to do early on was to kind of wrap that and to provide what you say, like an IPC mechanism. And I chose to use JSON messages to capture that information. Am I making a function call or am I trying to log? Am I trying to use the runtime? So I've got a bunch of standard messages. They get sent through that mechanism where I have a listener in Go. It's sort of dispatcher receives the message, works out what kind it is, and then sends it to a various subsystem based on the need. Once that's processed, the same thing happens, but in reverse.
So when you're building things like this, what types of limitations, I guess, do you see compared to, like, a lot of times when you see a big company and they're going to build something for Windows or for, for Mac OS, they go out and look at, .NET, or they look at, I guess, Swift and Xcode and all those tools. Presumably with this, there are some limitations, or I mean, maybe there's not as far as like what you can do with the system, but like what sort of, have you noticed any limitations or things like that that would cause somebody to lean towards like going with Xcode and Swift versus this, or like what types of projects, I guess, would you see going each way?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on the individual project. I mean, the difference between running an application in native UI versus an application in a browser versus an application in a web view, which is even more limited than a browser, you're going to hit some limitation somewhere based on the use case. The obvious one is, complexity on a native UI perspective. How do I make that work on different platforms? There are some approaches that you can take to do that. When you do a server app, obviously you have that disconnect between the front end and the back end. And in a browser as well, you have things like local storage, which you don't actually have in a web view. And so the limitation, I'd say, of writing a Wails app would be twofold. One is it isn't a full browser, which makes it good, like in a way, like it's slimline, it's very good with resources. But you also don't necessarily know which libraries would necessarily work. So if you have, there are so many libraries out there. If you use one that uses something that's native to a browser, then you're going to hit that limitation. That's one. The other one would be that Wails uses the native renderer on your system. So there's pros and cons with that. The con is that on Windows, it's still basically IE11. So you'd have to deal with that. And there's a lot of libraries that kind of get around. I've not really hit that problem, but some people do. So that's just something.
It probably would have been more of a problem in the past, like
that's
when
right.
IE6 was around, for example, when you had to basically write two versions of every website.
You have like two CSS files. It's like, here's for you people in IE, and here's for everybody else.
Yeah, here's for all the cool people, and then 80% of the population of the planet is using IE6, so we still have to support that.
Yeah, that's right.
But Lee, you mentioned something interesting about multiple platforms. That's something we should actually, I think, highlight a little bit, because you literally can build, one front end, and you've got your Go code, and since Go code can be built for different targets, you can build Wails apps for different architectures, Windows, Mac OS, and others, and it's the same code for all of them, right?
That's absolutely correct. Yep.
See, that's pretty massive.
Yeah, that is. Until fairly recently, the limitation around that was that you could only build the platform that you were actually compiling it on. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, it uses C Go, so you have that complication. But fairly recently, we had an amazing contribution to the project, which allowed you to cross-compile using Docker. A big thanks to Travis as well, who works on the project. He spent quite a lot of time in getting that working really, really well.
Is that Travis CI?
Travis McLean, he works on the project. All right. Yeah, he managed to sort of iron it out a bit, polish it off, and it works really, really well. You have your initial kind of Xgo download, which is fairly large. It's around 7 gigs, which to some people is a lot. To some others it isn't. But once you have it, you can compile multiple platform targets on the same computer. So.
And speaking of Travis CI, I mean, you could probably easily build that into a continuous integration environment and have your build system build and deploy these apps, right? Using that image.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that moving forward, I wouldn't mind having a look at Go Releaser and seeing how I could integrate with that. How you could, because that seems like a really good fit.
Yeah, I used that recently, actually, and it was really good. Basically, you tag your repo with a semver semantic versioning tag, and then you just run Go Releaser, and it creates a release, uploads it to GitHub for you, writes the change log, and there's a lot more you can make it do, but by default, it sort of does do that. It would be great, something like that. But the nice thing, I think, that makes this a really cool project is that it's, however you build it, it's one code base that's running everywhere. So you can really get, say, a big saving. And, if you think about all the things you can do in Go code, like accessing the file system. Presumably, you can access the file system in Wails apps, right?
Absolutely. You can do whatever you would like to do on your Go site. There's no limitations on that. What I have done is provided a runtime which operates both in the JavaScript land and the Go land. So some of that stuff's wrapped up for you. So, maybe you want to show a file select dialog. So you can call this runtime command in Go, and Wails version 2, which we'll talk about in a bit. Like, you can also do that on the JavaScript land. So you can essentially call a function, open a dialog, get the user to select something, and that just appears as a string in Go. So it's almost like a synchronous operation in your Go, where you say, I want to get a file name, and it goes away and does it for you.
Is it like a file? Do you get literally the file scheme on that when it turns up in Go then? And is it just a path to a local file?
It's just a path to a local file, and then you can use open and just read it in.
So it doesn't upload through the web view. You're just selecting the string. Right, I see.
Yeah, it's just a means of getting a string into Go.
Yeah, I bet there's a big range of different things that you can suddenly do, which you wouldn't do probably in the server context. That's what I mean. It's quite exciting when you start to think of building desktop apps like this in Go. Are there any other sort of cool use cases that you've come across?
In terms of actually the stuff that you can build, or in terms of the tooling that's provided so that you can build?
Oh, either, yeah.
So one of the sort of things that I'm pretty proud of in the project is early on I realized that the IPC mechanism, the way that you communicate from the front end and the back end, it's not dissimilar to WebSockets. And so what I started thinking early on, because I wanted the project to be very developer focused, like how do I make it easy for the developer? And one of the things that I kind of hit early on was the integrated debugger and the tooling that comes with a web view is actually pretty limited, compared to the things that you're used to. So in Chrome, the dev tools are just incredible. And that's what people want to use. They want to use the things that they're used to. So what I did was to create a compile flag, because you don't compile using Go build, you use Wails build. And the reason for that is because there's a bunch of stuff that it needs to do, including like installing dependencies and packaging, all kinds of stuff. So I've wrapped that all up. And you can pass a flag which essentially creates a headless version of your backend code, and sets up an actual web server inside your code. What you can do then is if you run, it tells you what command to run. You run the command, and the front end gets served up by its native tools. So in Vue, I think it uses like Webpack Serve or one of these kind of runners. The front end actually has some code that's injected into it, which connects to your backend code. So now you're running in the browser, but you're still connected to a backend. So you can open up the dev tools, and you can start just calling your Go code from Chrome. And that becomes incredibly powerful because you can all of a sudden start using your Vue tools, your React dev tools, all that kind of stuff. The drawback of that is people get used to things working in the browser. And so sometimes you get tickets raised that say, I don't understand, it works in serve mode, but it doesn't work in compile mode. And that's like a tricky line to walk, because you do want to provide the best tooling, but you also know that it's not entirely 100% like for like. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, it's kind of a trade-off.
Yes.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's exactly it. The web view is more limited. And like you say, it comes from the operating system. So I guess on a Mac, it would be Safari, would it? Essentially?
It uses WebKit.
Oh, right, yeah. Which Safari uses, doesn't it?
That's right.
And you mentioned events then as well. And that's quite an interesting thing when we think about Go, and we have channels and we have different ways of running things concurrently and communicating events. Can you also get those events to fire in the front end part of the app? Like, so something happens in the back end, maybe if it's going to walk the file system, it's going to take a long time. Maybe there's an event to say, I've just completed. How does that get into the front end?
Good question, Matt. So as part of the runtime, there's a unified events system. So you have, on the Go side, you have emit and you have on, and it's the same in the front end too. And whenever you emit a message, you do it in the standard JavaScript way. It has a name, and it has that optional data on with it. If you fire that from Go, you can read it in Go, and you can trigger on it in JavaScript. And the reverse is true. So you could say have a JSON string or whatever kind of data. In the front end, you could emit an event by a name and receive that in Go. So it was quite interesting early on, like thinking about the differences between that and a call. So yeah, that sort of unified eventing really opens things up, because early on I hooked up, is it Vegeta, GIF, I don't know how you say that. It's a sort of web load testing tool. It's a library, essentially, and it's just a library. And I wanted to sort of put a front end to that as a test and work out, how is this going to work? How do I visualize this, that it's doing? Because it's obviously going to do a whole bunch of stuff in the background. How do I view that? And so you have the obvious thing of, here's my URL, and this is how long I want you to run, and these many concurrent threads. And one of the things that the library did, and probably still does, is provide a callback. So like every, say, 1,000 events, it just returns you some information. And in Go, that's a struct. So it's a struct with, with all of that information in. And what it did was I basically spawned that off in a Go routine. So you have that running in the background, and every 1,000 requests or whatever, you get this struct. And all I did was just emit it. So I just passed the struct into an emit call. On the front end, I had a listener. And when it received that information, initially I just printed it out on the console. What was amazing was, because the developers had put JSON tags in their struct, all of a sudden I had this really rich JSON object with all of this information in it. And because these days components are very much driven by JSON state, you can just pop that straight into a state store, and all of a sudden your front end reacts to everything that's happening in your Go library. And that blew my mind, I've got to say. It was just incredible to see.
Yeah, because you haven't had to do much work at all there for that quite powerful thing, event-driven live updates occurring in your desktop app.
That's right.
It is quite exciting.
What's up, Gophers? Are you looking for a way to instantly debug and troubleshoot your applications and services running in production on Kubernetes? That's a mouthful. Well, Pixie gives you a magical API to get instant debug data, and the best part is this doesn't involve changing code, there are no manual UIs, and all this lives inside Kubernetes. Pixie is an API which lives inside your platform, harvests all of your data that you need, and exposes a bunch of interfaces that you can ping to get data you need. Pixie is essentially like a decentralized Splunk. It's a programmable edge intelligence platform which captures metrics, traces, logs, and events without any code changes. And the team behind Pixie is working hard to bring it to market for broad use by the end of 2020, but I'm here to tell you how you can get your hands on the beta today. Links are in the show notes, so check them out so you can click through to the beta and their Slack community. Once again, links are in the show notes, check them out, and look forward to Pixie Day coming soon.
So as you were developing all this, I mean, it sounds like you had to come up with a lot of unique solutions to like allow the two to communicate and allow things to work the way that makes the most sense. With things like WebAssembly coming along, do you think they would eventually make it so that this type of stuff would be easier to do in like almost any language, or are there still going to be big limitations?
Yeah, I don't really know too much about WebAssembly, I've got to say. I followed its journey in the early days, but I don't really know how it would impact things. I'm pretty excited that that the technology exists. I think it's going to be great. Part of my brain thinks we're sort of going back to the Flash days as well. I don't really know why, but there's something in my head about that. But I do think it's a great opportunity. And in terms of the impact, I genuinely don't know. Yeah, I think we're likely to see more and more WebAssembly targets, assemblies, drive desktop applications. Like, it kind of makes sense maybe this is, this project is kind of a stepping stone towards that, that sort of concept of you write once and run many, which is something that we've always tried to achieve in different ways.
Yeah, I should definitely say I don't know a lot about WebAssembly, but like the idea of, write it, compile it into JavaScript, I guess, and run it at wherever, like that's appealing in the sense that, if I can just write regular code and it works, that's real nice. And like we're all spoiled with Go because it works pretty much everywhere. But, when you have languages where that doesn't work, or anybody who's tried to ship like a product that they wrote in Python or, some other language, and they, you ship it to somebody and they're like, well, it's not working. It's because their Mac OS has like a really old version of Python or something. And it's like, how do you handle these situations? And I think that was one of the things that always made delivering like any sort of software to a desktop user that wasn't written in their native language could be a nightmare.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm assuming this is like sort of similar to like how Electron works, but I don't know enough about Electron to say for sure. Is it comparable in some ways?
Many people do draw that comparison, and I'm very, very reluctant to draw that comparison. I would say that the two projects are different, right? They've got different target audiences. They kind of work a bit differently. The only kind of overlap is that they essentially achieve a similar thing, which is a desktop application with web technologies. That's pretty much where I draw the comparison there.
Okay. So, like, do you know enough about Electron that I can ask questions to sort of, flesh out some of those differences?
Yeah, sure. I know a little bit. I'm definitely not the world's expert on it.
So is Electron using web views?
No, it uses an embedded Chrome instance.
Okay, so it uses something entirely different. So that would be like one of those cases where it works on Chrome, but like it could solve that type of problem, but it probably comes with its own set of like challenges.
Resources mainly.
Okay.
It uses a lot of resources.
Okay, so from that point of view, it's like not even like we start to step away. It's not even using web views. It's just something built entirely differently.
Yeah, so it's almost like bundling Chrome with your application where Chrome only executes your code, is my understanding. But it's also like it gives you a very easy one single target problem. So as long as it works in Chrome, you're good.
So when you're running in WebView then, I assume you have the JavaScript running there. Do you run into some other limitations like with browsers? Like one of the ones that comes to mind is like cross-origin resource sharing. Like if you use the JavaScript to actually talk with an API for some reason, which might not make sense with Wails, but I guess might be possible. Not really sure. Well, first off, is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, like it's kind of interesting because the front end and back end, they have similar ways of doing things. So you can make an HTTP request from JavaScript, but you could also do it from Go. So you'd likely hit whatever limitation you'd hit on one end, you'd hit on the other. The cross-origin, I don't think you have that problem. I'm pretty sure you don't, because it's not really running as a server, and it's not a browser that's going to guard you from that kind of thing.
I was going to say, usually that's something browsers would prevent, and I wasn't sure if WebView, like if that itself was like close enough to a browser that it had it or not, so I wasn't like quite sure.
Yeah, I don't believe so. I think you're okay with that.
Well, even if you couldn't, though, you can always just make it on the Go side and then call a function. And
yeah,
probably that's how you'd want to do it anyway, I think, because at least I would, because front end, back end does give you quite a nice boundary for testing. So it'd be a nice surface to test. If all your tests that were calling those public methods all passed, you'd have a level of confidence that the app itself's going to work too, I suppose. So I would probably do that anyway. I would put as much of the logic as I could into the Go side, just because that's where I'm more comfortable. But it does let you do things like that. You could just make HTTP calls. You could make other kinds of connections that would be impossible in browsers too, right? I mean, you could make bespoke binary protocol, maybe some bespoke API or something, some service that you want to consume. You do kind of solve that by having this environment that is both Go running natively and also this web concept running kind of right there too.
You make a great distinction there, and it's one of the recommendations of the project. When you build your application, like think about that your state and your business logic really should be living in Go, and your web front end really should just be a view on that. Which sometimes is a concept that's different to people who have used a lot of web technology and kind of dealing with state on the front end. The idea of the eventing system is really to keep those in sync, more as you should probably just take that approach of pushing the state rather than trying to deal with it in two places. I know that some projects do try and keep those in sync. And so, you might end up in a kind of split brain situation. And yeah, my recommendation is you just don't bother. Just push your state to the front end and react to your state on the front end in a visual way.
I think part of that might come from, like, when you're building something with a web server, you have to worry about latency, especially if you have users who are in a low latency area. So they try to kind of think, how can I keep this state and minimize some of that latency? Whereas with something like this, where you're both running on the same server, there realistically shouldn't be much, if any, latency at all. And the only way, like, when I was thinking about people making JavaScript calls, I was sort of thinking somebody who maybe has the JavaScript app and they're like, can we make something that, like, self-hosted type version or something like that? And I could see them making that mistake of just trying to port the same thing over when the two approaches, while the UI might be similar, but like some of the how you do it might be something you'd want to change up.
Yeah, that's right.
So what about like a desktop icon? Is that how this binary looks? Because normally in Go, when you build a binary, you get a kind of default terminal looking application. And if you double click it, nothing happens. You have to kind of run it in a terminal. What's the asset you get after you've done Wails build?
So there's basically two build modes. There's kind of two targets. There's a sort of desktop application target, so a packaged version which has an icon and it's something you can double click and run. And the other one's just kind of like your standard Go output, which is just a terminal app that you run. You mainly use that for development. Like on Windows, for instance, it's good to run that in that mode, just so you can see like the debug output and all that kind of stuff. But Wails does come with the ability to pack down to a package. So on Windows, that's essentially, it generates the manifest file, it generates the different range of icons that you have, the different sizes into an icon file, and then it compiles that up into the exe that you would expect from any other build tool. For Mac, it generates a .app directory structure, it creates the plist, generates the icons, and so puts it together in a way that works on a Mac. So you don't need to package it either. That kind of comes for free too.
And of course, the assets are all embedded in the Go binary, so you don't have to even put the assets into that package either, do you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you have like the Wails build command, and you mentioned Packer, which I know from using it, you have to use like the Packer build command. So I assume the Wails build is in part to replicate that behavior of grab all the assets, turn them into byte slices or whatever, and stick them in the binary. Are there other things going on behind the scenes when you're running Wails build? Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So basically, all of the things that it does is essentially, there's a project JSON file which basically tells Wails how to build your project. So what command do I run to install my front end dependencies? What command do I use to compile my front end to the assets? Once it does those two commands, it then gets those assets, runs an external command, which is something that I created, and now wish I hadn't, which packs up those assets and puts them inside a Go file, pretty much the way Packer works. It then compiles everything in Golang, including your packed assets, into a single binary. If you've decided to package it at that time, then it will then continue through and do a platform-specific packing. So on Windows, I think it uses WinRes to compile that down to a single binary. On the Mac side, it's a little bit more manual from a compile perspective, in that it sort of just creates directories and puts things in various places. And that's pretty much what goes on. It's fairly customizable because the actual system assets that it generates, it comes with default manifest file for Windows. It comes with a default icon, for instance. And it leaves those in your project directory once it's built. So if you change them, then that's your opportunity to customize your builds.
So when you're embedding those assets, I know recently there was like an embed proposal for Go. Have you had a chance to check that out?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I wish had been there before I decided to try and make a Packer. That would have been good. There's many solutions to this problem. So
does that solution looks like it would solve the needs you have then?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much involved in packing a binary asset into your application. So, I mean, it only does one thing. So long as it does that, then I think we're good.
Yeah, I quite like the similarities, and Mark Bates was actually, or is working on or was before this proposal, because this proposal may supersede it, but yeah, he was working on a new API that mirrored the OS package. So you basically open files and, you can stat them and you use the proper, like the existing API, essentially a copy of it, except that it goes through this layer where they may be embedded in the binary and you sort of can't tell. And I think the Go draft proposal, and we'll post notes in the show notes, we'll post a link to it. I think it has that same kind of idea, which is nice that you get to kind of, use the learning you have already from existing APIs. That may well be cool. And the nice thing is, Wails could adopt that and upgrade that, and it almost wouldn't change anything for anybody, would it? It's almost an internal piece which happens transparently, right?
That's right. And it's one of those things as well, pretty much the Go philosophy is that frameworks are frowned upon. And I guess I tend to agree, even though I've created a framework, I kind of tend to agree that it's...
You frown upon it, even though you made it.
Exactly, yeah.
Do you do that with your kids as well? You made them, but you're like, yeah.
No, only with the man in the mirror. Yeah. But there is a place for it, right? So yes, I firmly believe in, composition and having choices in that. So long as you're okay with the cost of that, which is you have to do the integration, you have to do the plumbing, you have to deal with the idiosyncrasies of all of the various components. And so whilst I've, created this framework and there is some stuff that's hidden, like the compiling of the assets and the bundling of assets, you do have to ask the question is, do I care? Do I really want to deal with that stuff? That's something that an individual has to decide, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Sometimes if it's the right fit. And I think, what's been valuable about this conversation is talking about the sorts of problems that Wails is going to be good for. And I think there are a class of applications where, and certainly, I've built an Electron app. I bought an extra RAM and really wanted to put it through its paces. So I just built a basic Electron app. Yeah, it was opinionated and it did these things, and it wasn't quite right. It wasn't what I was used to. And so Wails kind of fit that perfectly. And so I think there is a sweet spot for Wails. That's why I'm glad we talked about this and got to kind of hopefully get some people's eyes on it, because some of the things you can build are kind of limitless, really. It's web technologies. We can even create images in Go. Using the image draw packages, you can actually build images and things. So you'd be able to do even that kind of visualizations and stuff for Wails apps, right? So in a way, it's extremely powerful. And it doesn't do too much as well. That's the other thing. It solves kind of core problems and then not much else. So as a developer, you still have to solve those problems in the way that makes sense for your particular case or for the particular problems you're solving. So I think it finds that nice sweet spot, personally. That's why I recommend people play with it and see what they can build. It's very exciting because, doing Go, you spend a lot of time in servers or in web contexts or building things that are quite abstract. And, to have something that's just an actual application, I think it's going to be quite nostalgic and quite fun for people that haven't done it before.
Yeah.
How much time does your team spend building and maintaining internal tooling? I'm talking about those behind-the-scenes apps, the ones no one else sees. The S3 uploader you built last year for the marketing team, that quick Firebase admin panel that lets you monitor key KPIs, maybe even the tool your data science team hacked together so they can provide custom ad spend analytics. Now, these are tools you need, so you build them, and that makes sense. But the question is, could you have built them in less time, with less effort, and less overhead and maintenance required? And the answer to that question is yes. That's where Retool comes in. Rohan Chopra, engineering director at DoorDash, has this to say about Retool. Quote, "The tools we've been able to quickly build with Retool have allowed us to empower and scale our local operators, all while reducing the dependency on engineering," end quote. Now, the internal tooling process at DoorDash was bogged down with manual data entry, missed handoffs, and long turnaround times. And after integrating Retool, DoorDash was able to cut the engineering time required to build tools by a factor of 10x and eliminate the error-prone manual processes that plague their workflows. They were able to empower back-end engineers who wouldn't otherwise be able to build front ends from scratch. And these engineers were able to build fully functional apps in Retool in hours, not days or weeks. Your next step is to try it free at retool.com/changelog. Again, retool.com/changelog.
It's time for Unpopular Opinion.
I actually think you should probably leave.
Okay, do we have any unpopular opinions?
I spent some time thinking about what the difference was between unpopular and controversial. And I wasn't really sure where that line was.
Okay, well, I haven't got time to re-record the theme tune, so but give us a controversial one if it's controversial. I mean, we've never had to cut one of these, so if you can give us one that we have to cut, even better.
Controversial means that like at least maybe half the audience doesn't like it, or they disagree with it in some way.
Right.
It's like popular by majority, I guess.
Right.
Well, okay, so I guess half the audience potentially does not think
It
that.
can't be half. It's got to be more than half, isn't it? Slightly. Just 51%. Can we just say the pedantic shoe is on the other foot? I mean, hand.
Unpopular opinion. Well, it's sometimes okay to mix Go and JavaScript code. Like, some people may think that that's not a great thing. I actually think that, you use things to their strengths. So, like we said about frameworks, like I don't really have a problem with frameworks. I have a problem with frameworks that have opinions different to me. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? We all have our way of doing things. And I guess it's the thing I love about Go is it doesn't really give you too many hard rules that you have to adhere to. Yeah. So I guess my unpopular opinion is everything is okay in whatever context is okay in.
That's very nice.
I was going to say, everybody loves Rails until it doesn't work for them. And then they hate it. It's that one time you need to configure something special, and it's like, no, we aren't going to let you do that.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a trade-off, isn't it? And it's almost the universal thing that we face all the time of kind of optimizing for read or optimizing for write. We choose a tool like Rails, we can quickly build with scaffolding, we can quickly build real things that are going to put things in the database. But then, of course, as soon as you want to do something different or something more or whatever, then, you then have to put in the time to do that. And yeah, the problem is when you're fighting the framework, right? That's what I like about Wails is, it doesn't force you to use a particular web technology. It's kind of somewhat agnostic. So your teams will get to use expertise they already have in order to then build desktop apps. And I think that is quite a valuable thing in itself. But yeah, it seems like if it was more opinionated, of course, then there are going to be more cases where it hits up against things that it doesn't do naturally or doesn't do very well. That's what I was saying. I think it has a nice little sweet spot.
I think you've actually made me realize something. I've completely missold this thing, haven't I? It's actually a tool. It's not really a framework because frameworks imply there's lots of opinion. There isn't. It's really just a tool to compile things, to build things. Yeah, it's more of a developer tool. So, interesting.
A build tool is probably more accurate because we talked about Fine, I think, last time we looked at GUIs. And like it's a lot more opinionated, I think, like in how you like a button and thing like I think all those things kind of look the same in that, if I recall correctly. And it has some basic, I guess, scaffolding you sort of use to build things like in the UI. And it gives you the ability to quickly throw something together and make it work on multiple operating systems. But like there are limitations to that based on what they think things should look like and like, what their version of a checkbox is or something. So, it goes both ways. And I think yours is probably as far like as unopinionated as possible is what I'd call Wails.
And tell us about the name, because it happens to also sound like a country, doesn't it?
It does, man. It does. And do you know what? It's really funny. Do you know, sometimes you have a concept in your head and you think, oh, my context for this thing is this. And at some point, something shifts and you're like, oh my God, how did I not think about that? And this is a classic example of that. It was actually called Wails, just WebView Rails. Like, that's all it was. No part of my brain at that time really associated with the actual country I'm from. No idea why. And then afterwards I thought, okay, yeah, of course, that was probably there somewhere when I was naming this. And so when I was looking for a logo, I kind of developed one which was a bit of a homage to the Welsh flag. So yeah, there is a link there, albeit unintentional.
And if anybody doesn't know what the Welsh flag looks like, definitely Google it. It's definitely one of the best flags there is. It's essentially a red dragon, which I think is really cool. And yeah, the Wails logo does kind of invoke that. So I think that's nice. And it's nice to kind of see a personal link like this in a project. I think it's quite a cool thing. You don't see it too often.
So how did this not lead to confusion in your real life? Like you're outside of the computer world where you're like, yeah, I work on Wails. And they're like, or I created Wails. And they're like, you didn't create the country, bud. Like they didn't get confused?
There's a lot of confusion in my life, John.
They probably don't think he means he's created the country Wales. That probably isn't the...
I mean, if he's out at the bar or something and he's like, yeah, I made this Wales, they're like, this guy's just had too many. Let him be.
Because you don't live there. You don't live there now, do you? You moved.
I moved a long time ago. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
And I miss it. It's there's a wonderful word in Welsh called hiraeth, which is pretty much untranslatable in English, but it kind of means this longing for, this nostalgic longing for things that were. And any Welsh person listening to this will potentially understand what that is.
That's awesome. Oh, I feel like we should get some more Welsh on the show. Because it sounds like, to people listening, I think, it sounds like Elvish from Lord of the Rings. Like that's how I've heard people describe when they hear Welsh being spoken. That's like the close reference.
The irony of that is that Elvish is, a certain type of Elvish is actually based on Welsh. So that's why.
Ah, that's why. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Makes way more sense now.
Tolkien was obsessed with the language, which is kind of interesting. But he was obsessed with languages in general. So
yeah, he made the whole language, didn't he? Didn't he make Elvish the language and actually did all the work to build it into a real language?
Yeah, I think that was his primary thing. Like that's what he really enjoyed doing. I don't know too much about it.
Did Lord of the Rings on the side?
Yeah,
Pay the bills somehow.
I'm making up these bonkers languages. No one's going to use them. I've got to find a reason for people to use them. I'm going to have to write a 6-part epic.
That's it. And this D&D genre is not going to invent itself. So
yeah, magic.
He didn't like go the open source route and be like, we're going to provide support for the language first. That didn't work. So you had to go some other route.
Yeah, you had to build it into something you could sell.
I like talking about tools like this because I feel like there's a lot of potential in the learning space too for them, where when you build things in your learning, the terminal is kind of bland for anybody who's just getting into programming. But like if you can combine it with Wails so that they actually see visually like what's happening in their code, or like it can actually help them out, I feel like there's a lot of ways that you could make learning a lot easier, or at least different for different types of people who learn in different ways.
Yeah, you've hit on a really good point there, is that combining Go code into your documentation or your teaching material is definitely possible. I mean, we know that that's possible already with sort of the Go docs stuff. But what this does is it actually allows you to embed components that are aware of Go code. One of the things I wondered about early on was this concept of a package, and it's something I'm still kind of fleshing out in my mind. That components historically are just JavaScript. But imagine if you could have a package which bundled your back end as well as your Go code as well as your front end. So it's kind of Go aware front end components. And so you're able to compose your Wails applications using people's different components and potentially have this concept of a package manager where you can pull those in. I think it would lead to some pretty interesting projects.
We'll have to save that one for another day, I think. Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to Lea Anthony for joining us. If you want to build desktop apps with Go and web-based technologies, take a look at Wails. It's a genuine option, ready to go. It's past the V1 release. It's production ready. You can build real things with it. So do it and then tell us what you've built, please. Thank you very much. John, always a pleasure. Lee, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
See you next time.
If you're not following GoTime on Twitter, let's fix that bug. We tweet live show notifications, clips, and highlights from past episodes. We take polls about unpopular opinions and have a lot of fun. Join the conversation. We're at GoTime FM. Also, Changelog++ is now a thing. It's the best way to directly support GoTime and everything we create for you here at Changelog. Support our work, make the ads disappear, and get closer to the metal at changelog.com/++. The early adopter rate ends at the end of August. This episode was hosted by Matt Ryer and John Calhoun. It was produced by Jared Santo, that's me, and our music is provided by The Beat Freak, Breakmaster Cylinder. We're brought to you by some awesome people at companies who get it. Thanks again to Fastly, Linode, and Rollbar. That's all for now. Fuzzing next week.